Good morning. I'm delighted to introduce this second and final panel today for Petro Diplomacy. It's focused on the future, appropriately enough, and on the energy mix that will be necessary to address the needs in that future. I am delighted to introduce our panels today as we tackle this subject. Their full bios are on the website, but I wanted to give just a brief capsule bio of each of these distinguished guests that we have today. Our first guest is Joumana Hosri. She's the CEO of Sacotel Znshine. It's a joint venture and focused on supply of solar panels, particularly in the Middle East market. And her company is part of the UN Global Compact and has had lots of honors put its way, and Joumana as well. Jamie Ingram is a senior contributor and editor at Middle East Economic Survey, focusing on energy and political developments. Robin Mills, a good friend of AGSIW, is the CEO of Qamar Energy. He's a fellow at Columbia University's Global Energy Policy Center, and he's a non-resident fellow at AGSIW. Tofol Al-Nasr is a partner at Daleelaq Consulting with a diverse range of clients, including in the US, Asian markets, and Qatar, as well as other Gulf-based clients. Kate Dourian, well known to us. Kate is instrumental, of course, in pulling together the Petro Diplomacy for us. She's a contributing editor at Middle East Economic Survey, and she's a fellow at the Energy Institute, and of course, a non-resident fellow at AGSIW. Delighted to have these guests and to enjoy this concluding panel for AGSIW's Petro Diplomacy this morning. Kate, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to host you. Of course, I know all of you quite well, except for Tofol, so I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I sent you all a sort of few general questions on, basically we're focusing on the Gulf states with COP28 coming up, and the transition sort of is ongoing in many of the countries of the GCC, though at different paces. So how do we see the future energy mix of the GCC countries? I mean, most of them are oil exporters, significant oil exporters, except maybe for Bahrain. But we just heard from the IEA about the prospects for oil demand growth to 2028 over the next 5 years, and of course they see demand for transportation falling off, which obviously has an impact on oil demand growth and the different patterns of geographic demand growth. So how do we see the future energy mix over the next with net zero targets by 2050, 2060 developing over the next few decades? So I'm going to start with you, Joumana, because you're very involved in solar energy. And everywhere I look at all the latest reports show that we're not really on track, despite investment in solar energy being very, very high, in fact, overtaking fossil fuels. So how do you see that developing?
Hi, Kate. Thank you for starting with me. I'll give the idea from the supply perspective. Being a supplier of equipment, representing a Chinese manufacturer, we can say there will be more solar. In the area, there will be more solar globally. This is, a no-brainer. We all know that. Supply is bigger than supply. Demand is higher than supply, yes, because it is driven by the government decisions to do the right transition globally, the just transition in every country. So definitely there is a huge demand for solar panels, and in the Middle East, in the GCC, this trend is the same. We can see demand everywhere. We do not know how to answer our clients, and we are ramping up capacity. This is what I can say. So on the supply side, the main challenge is to ramp up capacity. This is something taken each and every manufacturer of solar panels, wherever they are doubling, tripling capacity within the coming 5 years. So from that side, it is covered. From the financial side, we know that there is money to cover this transition everywhere, in each and every country. It is not very well channeled for a just transition, but it can be, organized. It will take a bit of time, but it will be organized. So definitely more solar everywhere, more hydrogen, I would say too, because hydrogen, we've spoken about it a bit. You've spoken about it in the previous panel. Hydrogen will kind of fill the gap between the energy mix, the declining fossil fuel, and the increasing demand, which cannot be covered by solar and wind alone. So hydrogen will come and fill that gap. So definitely more hydrogen, more wind. Globally, not so much in the Middle East because of the limitation of wind availability. So few markets are looking at more wind, but this is not the biggest energy mix. So I would say solar, hydrogen, solar by itself, solar driven by hydrogen, because hydrogen to be produced needs to be green hydrogen, so will demand more solar, and the ratio is 1.5. So let's say a 1 megawatt hydrogen electrolyzer needs 1.5 megawatt of solar. So this is a very, very big, let's say, booster in the solar panel demand in the area. And as we know, the area is betting on the hydrogen to become a hydrogen exporter, to kind of replace the oil exports. I think this is an amazing opportunity for the area, and we'll talk about it. I know you have a question specific to hydrogen. So yeah.
I mean, one of the issues that came up yesterday is that hydrogen is not going to generate the same kind of income, because a lot of these countries that we're talking about are very dependent on oil revenues, gas export revenues. And that's why I'm sort of trying to see how is it maybe perhaps better to keep hydrogen as a domestic, for domestic use, to produce lower carbon product and then sell it on, rather than go through the whole hassle of exporting it. But that's something that we can talk about later on. What I basically was asking, is sort of the general question is, we've got COP28 coming up, and we always see at these COPs, at these climate summits, we always see this rush of new projects being announced. So I'm going to ask Jamie next, because he's next on my picture. Jamie, you've written a lot about, these massive projects that get signed, MOUs and pledges at previous COPs. Do you see that the next one that's going to be held in Dubai at the end of November is going to drive the transition forward?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a very contentious COP coming up in terms of being hosted in the UAE. That's resulted in a lot of criticism from the Western world, a lot of environmental organizations saying that it shouldn't be in a petro state, shouldn't be have the president, Sultan Al-Jaber, despite a strong background with Masdar in the UAE, which is a big renewables developer, also is leading a ADNOC large oil and gas producer. In terms of upcoming projects, as you say, we've seen a lot in the MENA region over the last year or so, what with the previous COP being hosted in Egypt. So we saw a lot of projects, interestingly enough and not surprisingly, between Egyptian parties and Emirati parties. So it's very much kind of these two COP events are very much a joint package in some ways, but the UAE is a very ambitious country in many areas. Clearly, they're going to want to make this a COP that stands out. They're talking about it being very much an implementation COP, and we're starting to see them kind of, I suppose, prepare the pitch for that already. So rather than necessarily waiting for COP itself to unveil certain projects, we're seeing them burnish their environmental credentials, as it were, with rolling out a number of new projects over the last year or so. In terms of how they're looking at the environmental transition and projects around that, big ambitious projects to connect ADNOC, for instance, its onshore operations to renewable and nuclear power plants, and this is clearly a huge development. We're seeing the Taziz plant, which is going to be have it as its center, I suppose, really a 1 million tons a year blue ammonia production facility. let's see, what else are they trying to do? They're looking to decarbonize the aluminium sector there with Emirates Global Aluminium. So a lot of these, rather than having brand new projects, a lot of what they're doing is seeking to decarbonize the existing facilities that we have here. And we've seen massive progress on this front over the last few years. Take Abu Dhabi alone, for instance, around 25% of the electricity that hits the grid there now comes from nuclear and solar facilities. That was for 2022. It's going to be significantly higher this year just because they brought on another unit of the Baraka nuclear power plant. We'll see another unit of that come online. Most likely, they'll start test operations there before COP28 kicks off. And then it will hit commercial operations next year. Dubai, the figure is about 8% from solar. That the MBR solar plant there, they label it the world's largest single site solar facility. They're bringing in bids at the moment as we speak for the 6th phase of that massive 1.8 gigawatt facility that could well see contracts awarded there by COP28. So a lot of momentum going in there, whether that's brand new projects or simply decarbonizing existing facilities.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm going to move on to Robin because, what we see is that even, as demand for oil declines, the share of the Middle Eastern producers is going to be higher because they've got the spare capacity, they've got the so-called advantaged oil, it's low cost, relatively low carbon. And you've written about, in fact, you wrote a piece for AGSIW about, we're running out of our carbon budget and the UN tells us that we really have to speed up the transition or we're not going to, make 1.5 degrees. We're going to go beyond the 1.5 degrees. And in fact, over the next 5 years, we probably are temporarily. So how do you see the transition is being driven at the moment because you need the oil revenues in order to drive the transition and economic diversification programs in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and in other countries. So how do you see the sort of the oil exporting countries developing their energy? We don't see that much CCUS yet, which is needed unless, because you're not going to make net zero. So your views maybe expand on the paper that you wrote about the sort of the shrinking carbon budget.
Yes, thanks, Kate. Yeah, so look, a couple of key points I want to make. The first one is that the future energy mix in the Gulf is depends on each country's domestic position, and we've talked a bit about that already. How's it going to power its own economy in the case of each GCC country, and then on the export position, is it going to continue exporting large amounts of oil and gas? What prices will it get for that? And each of the 6 GCC countries is in quite a different position, and has also taken quite different steps on this. So if you talk about the domestic transition, you have, of course, as Jamie reminds us, you've got the UAE, which has gone very heavily into nuclear. The other GCC countries have not gone for nuclear. Saudi may, but hasn't done yet. You have Saudi and the UAE and Oman, and to some extent Qatar, who have gone quite actively into solar power. The other GCC countries have not. Qatar obviously has huge gas resources. The others have less gas, or their gas is kind of more directed at domestic use than export. So quite a different position in each case. But also quite a different sense of policy approaches and policy urgency. So the second key thing is here, I think we really need to distinguish this domestic economy from the export economy when we talk about climate, because each country under the Paris Agreement commits to these nationally determined contributions. How is it going to reduce its emissions? How is it going to hit net zero if it has made a net zero commitment by 2050 or 2060? And to that extent, domestic use of solar power and nuclear and more use of energy efficiency and hydrogen, perhaps, other things is obviously very important. What happens in the export economy is quite different because that's really determined by what the rest of the world does, and that's why I think a lot of this debate about the UAE is increasing oil production and so on is missing the mark. The UAE is increasing oil production because it sees there's demand for it. Now you may think that's a failing on behalf of the rest of the world in not taking its climate commitments sufficiently seriously. But the International Energy Agency's net zero forecasts or scenarios by 2050 still have a pretty significant amount of oil use and even more so of gas. So there still is a need for oil and gas production out to 2050, even in a net zero world. I think we have to think each country is supposed to make its own its own contributions. The GCC countries have to take a view: is there a market for our oil and gas in the long term? If there isn't, then presumably it doesn't make sense to invest in it. It's a bit of a different question, I think, from the carbon budget. The carbon budget is obviously a constraint that's imposed by the climate system. Will the political and economic system keep up with the carbon budget? That's another question. So far, it hasn't. Things have improved. Climate policy's got more stringent, but we all know we're way short of where we need to be. And this, I think, brings me to the CCS question and the question of kind of the use of hydrocarbons in general. This is a big part of the COP28 debate. Should the resolution at COP28 be to phase out fossil fuels, or should it be to phase out unabated fossil fuels, i.e., fossil fuels that are causing emissions? And I think the position of the UAE and other oil-producing countries and coal-dependent countries such as India and China would be, no, the problem is the emissions, not the fossil fuels themselves. If Europe, for example, wants to phase out fossil fuels, that's very much open to do so. That's not the only way of approaching climate change. And in this regard, carbon capture and storage is absolutely essential, of course, particularly for gas. I think most uses of gas can continue, but combined with carbon capture and storage. Oil is a bit more tricky because oil is used in transport, and it's not really feasible to fit carbon capture and storage to certainly not to road and air vehicles, and in any way that those certainly road vehicles are going down the electric route at an increasing pace. But yeah, CCS has a very important part to play. This region has a very important part in scaling up its CCS capacity. We've seen some reasonably ambitious targets, but not nearly ambitious enough yet. We need to see a lot more ambition by 2030. We need to see some real projects on the ground. And that CCS, of course, goes along with blue hydrogen and blue ammonia, i.e. the production of hydrogen from fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage to produce kind of near zero emissions fuels and feedstocks. And to that extent, I think Kate's point about where should the Gulf states use hydrogen is crucial again. And to me, it's pretty clear. Yeah, there is an export opportunity, and that should certainly be pursued. But the really big prize is to use hydrogen domestically and to become a center of low carbon industries such as steel, aluminium, chemicals, and so on in a naturally advantaged region.
Thank you, Arvin. And you mentioned emissions. I mean, we look at all the reports that are coming out from the IEA, from IRENA, from the latest Energy Institute's reports that that emissions actually rose in 2022. I suppose we sort of emerged from sort of COVID lockdowns and so on, but and that will sort of the coal use will start to decline as new LNG comes online. And Tofol, that's where you come in, because Qatar is going to be one of the biggest suppliers of LNG as they carry on with their expansion plans, from the current 77, going up to 126 million tons in the future. So how is that being viewed from particularly when it comes to gas? Was seen as a transition fuel. It used to be, the golden age of gas, and then there was a lot of talk about methane emissions, and we really have to stop methane emissions and flaring and so on. So, how do you see the gas market sort of developing over the next few years as oil demand declines, because it's going to have a longer shelf life?
Thank you, Kate. When looking at natural gas and emissions, I think it's incredibly important to consider it, to look at things apples to apples when it comes to emissions. Everyone tends to look at comparing, natural gas as overtaking oil, which, of course, that's, one of the, factors and one of the things that we forecast and we expect to happen in the energy transition. But the natural gas overtaking coal is really the most important topic when it comes to emissions, achieving net zero and reducing emissions in the first place. Natural gas emits around 45 to 55% less emissions, greenhouse gas emissions than coal, and for power generation. And when it compares to oil, in the generation of electricity, that's around 30% less greenhouse gas emissions. So it's clear that in order to reach the climate goals that we have, given that renewables are still so low, in representation in the global power generation sector, natural gas is absolutely critical as a transition fuel, and it has less emissions and also has less pollutants within it, and that's because it's made up of methane. So it has a higher energy content. It can deliver a lot more power for the punch, for the same amount of power, for the same amount of energy. And that's really important because we see the IEA, OPEC, all the energy forecasts see energy demand increasing globally through, the 2045 predictions around 23%. And at the same time, we have to address the Sustainable Development Goals of energy poverty. We can't overlook that. I think that when it comes to climate discussions, everyone tends to look more toward the developed country perspective and forgetting about, sub-Saharan African countries without access to energy. So natural gas is absolutely vital. And Qatar is leading the way, as we know, with the 77 million tons per annum capacity right now, and looking to increase by 60% of natural gas production capacity by 2027. So I see it as a very positive thing, and natural gas is absolutely the necessary bridge.
I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to stay with you for a minute, because that's also one of the subjects that's very close to your heart. Because one of the things that came up yesterday was, we're talking about 1 billion people who don't have, mainly in the global south, who don't have access to even basic energy, clean cooking, and a lot of the victims of indoor cooking with using wood and biomass and so on indoors is a killer. And what I noticed yesterday, looking at the sort of all the talk about the investments, a lot of the subsidies last year that were that governments provided to shield consumers from high oil and gas prices went to the developed world, not to the developing world. So I want your perspective, because I know it's something that you work on, and so what is being done to sort of end energy poverty? And at the same time, we tell African countries, you can't really develop your oil and gas because it's and their argument is, well, we didn't cause it. We didn't cause the rise in global temperatures. So what is being done?
Well, I know that there are a lot of investments that are being made by individual wealthier countries, including Qatar and the UAE, two particularly impoverished countries, to help them seek to address their energy poverty issues while achieving, the climate objectives that we all want to see. You raise a very, very important point. It's the way that the funds are being channeled aren't necessarily to those who need it, but also something that is rather worrying, although completely understandable, and I'm sympathetic to it, is that sometimes when the funds are reaching the energy impoverished developing countries, sometimes the choice comes down to, do you address the hunger first with those funds, or do you address do you invest in a renewable power generation facility, which has a lot of long-term benefits, but as we understand, in politics, how would a political party stay in power to achieve, these are long-term objectives. So it's really, it's very challenging. I think it requires it requires a lot of help, and these helping developing countries and to address energy poverty isn't at odds with, doesn't have to be at odds with economic development or with reaching a net, zero future. We can see with companies like Joumana, if you have a brand new slate in sub-Saharan African countries with massive renewable energy resources, then that's a wonderful opportunity, and it could present excellent economic investment opportunities for these sovereign wealth funds that we have in the Gulf.
Thanks. I'm going to go back to Joumana because I was at a conference recently and they were talking about these electrolyzers. As you said, it needs, 1.5 times the energy to sort of split, because hydrogen, as somebody said yesterday, hydrogen and oxygen actually are very sort of closely linked, and it's very hard to break them apart. And somebody mentioned that in China, I think they have one of the biggest electrolyzers, and that it would take about 2.5 hours to drive around the solar farm, the solar park that is needed to power this electrolyzer. Now, it may, I don't know how true that is, but obviously China is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, producer of electrolyzers. And, we talked about costs, and costs will have to come down because it is still very costly to produce green hydrogen.
Yes and no. Let me tell you personal experience. So I've just returned from China because there was the Shanghai Solar Fair, and it was the first time we as foreigners could go back to China after the opening up. So a huge, the crowd from solar people were present in China at that time. Of course, hydrogen being the next most important topic, all of us were interested also in hydrogen. So I took the opportunity to visit hydrogen farms, but most importantly, hydrogen equipment facilities. Mm-hmm. And this is really, really impressive to see how China, in the past 3 years, where I haven't been to China, has ramped up capacity to deliver hydrogen electrolyzers, or if we call them hydrogen generation sets, because it's not just the electrolyzer, it's the whole system where you start with the splitting the electrolyzer, then liquefying and purifying and all of the, so it's hydrogen generation system that come as a kit in containerized solution. So the biggest at the moment that I have seen is 5 megawatt electrolyzer. Which is massive. If you see the picture, it's like a 40-foot container for the electrolyzer alone. And it's the plant will be made out of multiple 5 megawatt electrolyzers that are put together. And imagine the solar farm, and you can go in hundreds of megawatts without any hesitation. I mean, this is what the plan is, to make mega farms of hydrogen. The space, the land footprint of the hydrogen generation set itself is not so much. What is very impressive is the solar part to power the electrolyzers. So this footprint of the solar farm to power the electrolyzers is very impressive, which brings us back to the area. So we are blessed here for 2 reasons, Kate. One, we have a land bank. We have land capacity in the GCC area, right? 2, we have amazing solar irradiation. 2 components that other countries, off-takers, and we spoke about Japan earlier, but Germany, Europe, these are the main off-takers where the demand for green hydrogen is. They both lack of land and irradiation. So these are the 2 main components to make cost efficient green hydrogen. So this is why I started by saying yes and no. So if you have those 2 components, mostly irradiation, of course the green hydrogen will be cheaper. You'll have to transport it. That's the next hurdle that we'll have to overcome, but it's not complicated. Oil and gas were transported, ammonia will be transported, will be transported even in a more efficient and supply chain. So this is my answer to you.
Thank you, Joumana. Jamie, one of the problems that we've seen in Europe, in the United States, is that as we grow renewable energy sources, the grids can't handle them. So there's a lot of wind farms that are just sitting there waiting to be connected. And there's also permitting issues. It takes sometimes years to get a permit to build a wind farm. And as Joumana mentioned, I think we're going to get one of the biggest in the world wind farms in Egypt. That's a deal with Masdar. I think maybe you can talk a bit about that, because it is clean. It's not as cheap as solar energy in the Middle East, but it is one of it's, it is a growth area, particularly as we are seeing demand growth in the Middle East. I mean, after Southeast Asia, I think energy demand growth is highest in the Middle East.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, and it's not just that energy demand is growing as well as, we're seeing increasing electrification, as it was pointed out earlier, transportation switching to EV. So that's going to drive that electricity demand itself up even faster and faster and faster in the years to come. As you point out, a lot of issues with the grids. So when it comes to the discussions about renewables, I'd say the thing that generally takes the headlines is storage. You need the sun to shine for your solar. You need the wind to be blowing for your wind. So what do you do in terms of providing electricity when that's not happening? So okay, we need to invest in storage facilities to counteract this intermittency. But what gets addressed less is the impact on the grid, the national grids of countries as they roll out increasing amounts of solar and wind, and just as importantly, as they take offline thermal power plants. So this is something that countries are very aware of. They are investing heavily in it. Costs billions, frankly, to upgrade the grids to be able to handle this. In the UAE, it's interesting, as I mentioned, in Dubai, the MBR solar plant, that's described as the world's largest single plant, whereas in Abu Dhabi, speaking to people there, they were very much saying that when they choose the sites for new solar plants, they are not just looking at irradiation, but they're specifically looking at the grid in its totality to say, okay, if we put a plant here, that's okay for grid stability. If we put another one here, that's okay for grid stability. But if we have a couple here, that's going to throw things off kilter. So they're being very meticulous, very particular in where they are locating their solar plants, unlike in Dubai where it's all in one place. So that's a different challenge that these two emirates are going to have to manage. In Saudi Arabia, much larger landmass, of course. So again, we're seeing these solar plants being scattered across the country. Not just, people might think, oh, they're all going to be outside of Riyadh because that's large population center, but often, clearly that's not such an issue with electricity. So they're balancing it out across the country, large scale, small scale facilities across the country as a whole. We're also seeing, when it comes to managing grid stability, projects in linking individual separate countries' grids to each other. So Saudi Arabia and Egypt, they're linking with a high voltage direct current linkage, basically. I think that's meant to be online by the end of the decade. So that's, again, will help in terms of just managing demand across two different countries with different time zones, with demand peaking at different times, different seasons. That helps with that. And again, you can further link the HVDC cables on into Europe. So you get a kind of a north-south linkage and east-west linkage. It helps balance the grids for these countries as a whole, as we're pivoting more towards renewables and away from thermal capacity. So yeah, a lot of work going on grids overall.
Yeah, because I think, Robin, you had something in the roundup that you put out on sort of energy this week, and I think one of them was about Iraq and its electricity going off like disco lights or something like that. But anyway, Jamie, you mentioned the interconnector, the grid, the electricity grid, and I've often wondered why, given that you have countries like Qatar, which has a lot of gas, and you have importers within the GCC. Kuwait is an importer of LNG. The UAE is an importer of LNG, even though they are now building an LNG plant, a liquefaction plant. And one wonders why they don't integrate more. And maybe that's also a question for Tofol, that there is no sort of common gas grid, which would presumably lead to, particularly as it is still the base load, right? Gas is still the base load for electricity generation until more renewables kick in and maybe hydrogen. So Robin, your idea of where we're heading, are we sort of, the UAE wants to be self-sufficient in gas. They're not yet, but that's the purpose, as opposed to actually creating a regional grid that I think would help all of the sort of the gas poor or gas short countries in the GCC.
Yes, look, and I think these grid connections are crucial and extremely helpful for integrating renewable electricity. But the problem is countries are not willing to depend on them. And if you look at the amount of electricity trade, the GCC interconnection, for example, you are talking about 1-2 gigawatts. The Saudi Egypt link is 3 gigawatts. But the Saudi power system is about 78 gigawatts. So these countries are okay having a little bit of balancing interconnections, and they buy or sell a gigawatt here and there. They're definitely not willing to rely on neighbours for large proportions of their power generation. And that just goes to kind of a long and unhappy history in the region of regional cooperation or lack of it, and problems with cross-border pipelines and so on that have often not been reliable. And we see that problem even today. So this is, it's a problem that has to be overcome. But it is not unique to the Middle East. If you look at the global electricity trade, it is close to zero outside Europe. Europe is almost the only part of the world that has any significant electricity trade. Even in North America, the amount of electricity trade is minimal. So this is a tricky problem to overcome, but it's a global one. I think just a couple of things to draw attention to here. One is the storage issue. That is important, but it is not as difficult as we see in Northern Europe, for example. We have solar power here. It's obviously very strong during the day and during the summer when we have a lot of air conditioning need. So we're really talking about a problem of balancing not over from winter to summer like Europe has, but just balancing over the course of 24 hours. And with that, batteries are pretty well suited. So I think we can get to very high levels of solar power and still manage to balance the daily loads successfully. So that I find pretty encouraging. The other trend I think we talk about interconnections is this trend for long distance interconnections. And again, this becomes important on an intercontinental scale. And you see at the moment, there's a proposal, for example, for a long distance cable from Morocco to the UK, subsea cable, which would carry solar and wind generated electricity. And again, that is potential to bring some of the region's renewable energy resources to a wider market. It's an alternative or a complement to hydrogen in terms of interconnecting continents and making use of this region's very attractive solar power.
Thank you. Yes, Tofol, you had your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yes, I think you were asking earlier about the GCC power grid. So GCC is connected by a power grid, and it started in 2011. Oman joined in 2012, and it's been going very smoothly and successfully. And even during the blockade, when Qatar was blockaded, Qatar continued to participate and contribute to the grid, and it wasn't, it maintained its position as a reliable partner. And so it's this GCC grid that's connecting to Iraq. So just to clarify.
Yeah, no, I know there is a GCCIA, but again, it hasn't really lived up to its to what it was intended to do. And somebody is suggesting, why doesn't the GCC actually act more as a sort of economic bloc? Why don't we have a carbon trading market, which I think may be coming, Robin. I might be wrong, but I think that's because you need a price on carbon. If you are going to have CCUS, if you are going to decarbonize, you actually need to have a price on carbon, right? Am I wrong, or is that something that is lacking?
This is the thing that all CCUS projects in this region struggle with, and globally, and why has CCS not advanced globally over the past 20 years? Because there was no price on carbon, or it wasn't enough, even in Europe or North America. And you see now Europe and North America have a good price on carbon, or they have tax credits, so the same thing, a sudden rush of interest in CCUS. And we would see the same in the Gulf. So at the moment, you've got national targets, and it's left to the national oil company or some big government company to drive this. But as soon as we had a reasonable price on carbon, we would see a big uptick in CCUS. Many of our clients come to us and say, I'm an industrial company, I have a great CCUS project. Technically, it's great, but I can't make it economic because there isn't a price on carbon. As soon as that comes, that will happen. In terms of GCC-wide price on carbon, yeah, I think that probably has to be a second stage. I mean, there's interest in carbon trading in the region, but lining up the 6 GCC states on what the carbon price should be is going to be tricky. But I think we'll see it introduced at least by some individual countries in the hopefully not too distant future. And then, of course, there's the issue of Europe, and the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which basically says if you're a carbon intensive producer and you want to import into Europe, you want to import energy intensive materials like steel or aluminium, you have to pay the carbon price, the European carbon price, or you've got to lower your own carbon footprint. So that will kind of give a access to a carbon price in the Gulf for exporting industries. So that hopefully will also help guide the GCC to say, well, instead of paying this tariff to Europe, let's impose a domestic carbon price. At least we then hang on to the money ourselves.
Yeah, I think the border mechanism is an issue. I think also for Chinese exports to the EU, and of course we're seeing a bit more of the sort of nationalism when it comes to energy because of the whole energy security issue that was thrown out by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that sort of changed so much in trade flows. We saw east-west, west-east trade flows of oil and gas. So I was wondering how that is going to, we've obviously seen, we haven't had a supply emergency because of the Russian invasion. Everybody expected, or some people expected, that Russian supply would actually fall dramatically. Maybe Jamie, you can come in here, and because you've looked at this quite carefully and how it's affected relations between Saudi Arabia, Russia, the whole OPEC plus sort of alliance, and we have an OPEC meeting coming up soon. And there's a lot going on internally in Russia. How is that going to affect Russia's commitments to the OPEC plus agreement? Because prices at the moment haven't really risen, despite cuts by Saudi Arabia, voluntary cut of 1 million barrels a day. Because at the end of the day, we are still 80% of the global energy mix is fossil fuels. It's oil, gas, and coal.
Yeah, Kate, absolutely right. I mean, clearly OPEC plus, the circus there still attracts massive international attention whenever it meets in Vienna. Frankly, for Russia, it's one of the few globally important, internationally recognized entities that it still has a seat at the top table. And that is very important for Russia. It's a demonstration to the citizens and to the world that they're a big player that everybody needs to listen to. So Russia is willing to make some compromises in order to maintain its seat at the top table within the OPEC plus alliance. We've seen the Saudi-Russia issue didn't get as much play as perhaps people were expecting it to earlier this month when they last met. Russia essentially is now the OPEC secondary sources have reassessed Russia's production levels. New targeted production figures for Russia have come in off the back of that. Saudi Arabia is broadly happy with that, I would say. Does anybody expect Russia to actually fully implement its 500,000 barrel a day voluntary cut? No. Frankly, but then in 2020-21, Russia was not fully implementing its OPEC plus commitments anyway, at a time when oil prices were significantly lower, and therefore there was a much bigger incentive for the likes of Saudi Arabia to try to twist Russia's arm into actually fully implementing its commitments. So if they didn't do it then they're probably willing to let 100,000 barrels a day, 150,000 barrels a day here slide from Russia. Obviously, the other issue is whether Russia simply implements this 500,000 barrel a day cut because it is unable to maintain production at higher levels. There's a lot of debate over whether the lack of investment, the lack of technical expertise is going to take its toll on Russian production and lead to larger involuntary cuts there. It seems as if there's enough know-how there. A lot of debate about how much kind of cheap technology is coming in from China to allow them to continue to produce at current levels over the medium term at least. So I think that as it stands, there's not too much of an issue when it comes to OPEC plus politics, Saudi, Russia. In terms of global supplies, clearly Russian volumes, they're still managing to find willing buyers. They're still managing to find markets. A lot of people point to that and say it shows that sanctions aren't working. Frankly, it shows that sanctions, as they were designed, are working because the last thing that the US and that the EU wanted was to generate even more of an energy crisis last year than they were already dealing with. So, you know, it was designed with sufficient holes such as price caps to enable Russian volumes to continue finding markets, and that's what's happened.
I think if prices were to fall even lower, maybe that alliance will be a bit more shaky, because, you know, at the end of the day, Russia's not pulling its weight, and Saudi Arabia seems to have bent over backwards to accommodate them.
Perhaps. I mean, you know, people are saying that, oh, Saudi Arabia's voluntary cut hasn't had that much of an impact on the global markets so far. I'd perhaps beg to differ on that. We're starting to see a real shortage of medium sour barrels, and that's what, you know, we've seen Brent being priced at a lower level than Dubai recently, but we don't want to get into too many technicalities on those kind of issues. But the oil markets are starting to get disrupted as a result of these Middle Eastern cuts in particular. So I think we'll see some big movements there coming up.
This is another sort of question to all of you. We don't really see that much nuclear. We've got UAE has a nuclear power station. Saudi Arabia is thinking about it. Egypt is building one. But we discussed yesterday, you know, the small nuclear modular units, which are relatively easy to install. They can be used to produce whatever it is, pink or purple hydrogen, rather than solar. Is that not something that maybe should be considered as part of the sort of the transition? Because, you know, you don't need huge outlays. You don't need the big, you know, infrastructure project to install a small modular unit. I think you can have it offshore, you can have it onshore. There doesn't seem to be that much appetite in the GCC, or is that something that's being considered?
Yes, I'll speak to that, Kate. So I think, you know, the UAE, as you say, has got a very active and, you know, operational nuclear program. Saudi Arabia is kind of thinking about it, discussions with Chinese and you know, Koreans and so on, so that they may go for it too. I don't see any sign in the other Gulf countries, unless anybody's aware of other things. Egypt you mentioned as well. I think there would be openness to expand the nuclear program, but only at the right cost and when it seemed to be important and vital in the energy system. I think for now, certainly the UAE view would be solar plus existing nuclear and some gas backup is more than adequate. If small modular reactors approved elsewhere and the costs look good, I think absolutely there'll be openness to use them. You know, they can power desalination as well. They can be, even smaller ones can be used in remote communities, which would possibly apply to Saudi, and you know. However, for hydrogen, I don't really see it for these reasons. You know, to make competitive hydrogen, you need ultra cheap electricity. You're talking like 1-2 cents a kilowatt hour electricity, which you can get from solar. But for even the small modular reactors, let's be optimistic, they're at 5 or 6 cents if they work really well. It's too expensive. And if the Gulf can do small modular reactors at 5 or 6 cents, you can put them in Europe and make hydrogen next to where it's needed, or Japan or Korea. So I don't see any competitive advantage there. But you know, I think there's openness to it, but I just think they have to be proved elsewhere before the Gulf would really pick up on the small reactors. I don't see it being a leader in deployment.
Okay, and of course, Russia is the biggest exporter of uranium, raw uranium, and if you know, it poses a security risk if you were to rely on, you know, one supplier. Something else that came up yesterday was the fact that if you look at the latest statistical report that was taken over, the ex-BP statistical report that was taken over by the Energy Institute and published this week, it no longer has. We used to get the numbers for gas reserves, you know, per country, oil reserves. That's no longer there, but we do have metals and you know, all the raw materials that are required for renewable energy and the components. And of course, that again raises the question of there are very few suppliers, and not all of them are sort of countries that you would consider to be stable. Is that something that I think we're seeing some interest in countries like Saudi Arabia developing their own minerals? Is that another industry that can grow and support the the renewable energy drive. No? Joumana?
Yeah, I can comment on that. Okay, we've been seeing, we call them local content. So some markets that are kind of wanting to acquire the technology to have more security and to depend less on mostly China, because 90% of the solar panel manufacturing happens in China. And COVID showed us the risk, and now the Russia-Ukraine war shows another risk. So everybody's looking now at having a local content. The early movers were Saudi Arabia, because they have the size, the industrialization, they had the demand, they had the 30 gigawatt demand back then for 2030. They have the industrialization level, and they have the components, silica, aluminum, glass. They produce them locally. So it made a lot of sense to increase this local content. Other markets like India, for example, put a strong barrier for import, mostly Chinese import, 2 years ago. And why they want to acquire the technology, they said even if it costs higher, they want to, become a major player. They have high demands locally. And so it made sense. South Africa started that. They didn't really succeed. Europe cannot really start that, because they just exited from what we call between 2013 and 2018 September, there was kind of anti-dumping law against the Chinese module. So it's very recent. They cannot go back to something similar. They're not doing it openly, but they are trying to encourage manufacturing abroad. The US, however, is the latest comer and the most, let's say, abrupt and determined local content player, whereby June of next year, no solar panel can be sold in the US with subsidy unless the cell and the modules are produced in the US. While demand is huge, capacities in existence. So they're really, really ambitious on that take. So yes, this is a new deglobalization, because as we know, it wasn't a Chinese industry in the beginning. It was everywhere, European, US, and it became Chinese mostly because of I think the R&D that pushed, subsidized R&D that pushed and gave this scale, and Europe couldn't follow. And but now we are going to this deglobalization or local content, and we can see a lot of Chinese manufacturers opening up capacity everywhere in the world, Middle East, Europe, US, because they don't want to lose the grip on that. So yes, this is a very important I think change in the industry that is coming very fast. Within a year, we will see a lot of capacity outside China.
Yeah, as you said, it's a form of protectionism, and I think Europe is very worried about being overly. They learned a lesson from Russia, overly reliant on China. But there's huge investment flows from China into the Gulf states at the moment. I mean, the relationship has changed from just an oil relationship to a trade relationship. And of course, I don't think you can have a transition without China. And that's one of the markets where you're not going to have protectionism, because China is investing. It's buying a lot of oil as well, but at the same time, there's a lot of investment flows in technology and so on, and particularly in the clean energy sphere, which is going to create jobs as well. We have a couple of questions from the audience. I think one of them we kind of answered, but I'll start with the first one, which says, within the current international order, including the international financial system, where few persons or companies or countries hold wealth and resources, the majority of people and countries are impoverished, lacking resources for transformation of energy, mass transport. So how is this transformation to be financed, equipped and staffed with skills? And I think, skill building is going to be an important one. Tofol, would you like to take that one? How we kind of touched on this earlier when you spoke, but
about so the question, as I understand it, is about skill building with
and financing
and climate keeping climate goals in mind. With that, it's actually something that was on my mind when reading the description of our panel. On the side of building skills within the GCC, I was looking at it because of the question about the social contract between the governments and the people. But to address this question, it's the same. It's the same topic that came to my mind, which is the use of AI. As we know now, AI is completely prolific. It's, of course, there's a lot of fear mongering, and it's going to take jobs away, etc. But it has the potential to, as we know, to collect and gather a lot of data and to analyze and make sense of it in ways we cannot, and much faster than we could as humans. So capacity building in both, I would say, in the GCC and anywhere else in the world, including other developing countries, should be in the realm of digitization, of making the best uses and understanding of AI, and that way to have more skilled labor. And that's what we need across the board.
We actually had a conversation yesterday about, digitalization, which is very big, and it is actually used. I mean, I'm recently moved to Dubai, and I've done everything: set up a company, got bank accounts done. Everything was done online. Everything is digital, but that is also consumes a lot of energy. A lot of electricity, and I don't think anybody has really quantified just how much, the Bitcoin, everything now is electronic, and it's, I don't know how much that's going to add to demand for energy. I don't think any of us can answer this at the moment. The other question was about grid stability, and I think we kind of answered that there is a need to invest a lot more in grids. And maybe off-grid solutions for some of these countries that don't have access. Something came up. Okay, one of the other questions is long-duration battery storage to be manufactured outside of China? Example, in the US with the new Inflation Reduction law. Maybe EU going to help or hurt growth of solar plus battery systems for utilities, industries, and homeowners? I think, Joumana, you kind of answered that about the sort of local content.
I'd like to go back to the grid stability, because I had something to add. Jamie and Robin gave a very good expose, and I had two ideas to add on that, if you allow me.
Yeah.
So grid stability, we've identified, is a problem. Storage is a solution. And microgrid is another solution. A third solution is decentralized grid. And this is something very important because, for example, decentralized grid is what Dubai did with the initiative of Shams Dubai. So instead of relying only on Ben Rashid Park as the main generator of solar power and using the grid to distribute it, to bring it to the city, they used all the rooftops of the private building, government buildings in Dubai, and they connected that and electrified the city much closer to the city. So this model, which we call decentralized grid, is very, very important because much less losses, direct consumption, and can be replicated wherever. So we know a lot of countries are looking at this decentralized model, of rooftop, and this could be a solution to help ease, let's say, the grid stability. The microgrid, this is the case to help solve the issues in mostly Africa, where they are remote, they don't have a grid. So we create smaller microgrids that solve the issue of the grid, inexistent grid, because in these cases, most of the cases, there is no grid. So microgrid is an answer. And in terms of storage, of course, we know the battery storage, the lithium battery storage, which is still costly, but as Robin explained, is perfectly well adapted to Middle East because we are just bridging a few hours, which is the peak hour of let's say, the evening. However, there are two other storage solution. One that could also work very well in the Middle East, which is the hydro dams. We can use the water head as a storage. Instead of using it as a normal power, we use a floating solar on top of the dam, because this is very easy. The dam is already electrified, meaning there is a grid connected, so it's very cheap to do floating solar on the hydro dam. Use this solar during the daytime, and at peak hour drop the hat and use the hydro dam as battery storage instead of using battery. So this is quite creative, and I think not so much used and could be used in our area. And there is the third alternative, which is the hydrogen. And this is, I think, in the coming 5 years, hydrogen could be used as storage, and could be used as storage both in the Middle East, but also and mostly in Europe, because as Robin said, there they need seasonal storage, and hydrogen can be stored seasonally, right? So it is not like the battery where you need to, it would be very costly to store a huge amounts. So hydrogen could be used for storage. So here we have 3 vectors of storage that are going to be developed in the near, should be developed. Decentralize the grid, because this is an answer to also easing up on the grid. So I think this covers that part of the question.
Thank you, Joumana. No, you mentioned hydro, and that's really interesting because obviously climate change is having an impact on levels of hydro. I think China's suffering from it. Robin, I think you've written about the issues with hydropower in Iran, where we've also seen a decline, even though if you look at the numbers, which surprised me, Iran has more renewable, because if you include hydropower, but Robin, you mentioned, and of course, all of that has an impact on neighboring countries as well, because Iran supplies gas to Iraq, because Iraq has a gas shortage, electricity to Iraq, and as their demand grows, they're using more gas because they're running out of renewable capacity, hydro capacity. So maybe you can comment on that, and maybe give us also an idea of where Iran stands at the moment, because they don't have that much solar or wind or any other renewable except for hydro. And of course, Iraq is a big issue. So if we're talking about reducing emissions in the region where you have very, very high per capita emissions, even though they're not big contributors, the GCC countries are not big contributors to global temperature rise, but they are per capita consumers. And of course, Iraq is one of the worst flarers, as is Iran actually, in the world. So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, Iran does have a very large installed hydropower capacity, which would make it, in capacity big as the biggest kind of renewable player in the Middle East. If you don't include Turkey, Turkey has a lot of hydropower as well. But look at why Iran builds hydropower. These hydropower plants, they run at about 20% capacity because there's not enough water. And that varies a lot between year to year. So it's in Iran's case, it's become a very unreliable source, and it is a big problem for their energy system, because they've got a dry year and then they have gas shortages and power shortages even in summer sometimes. Then they cut off the power to power and gas to Iraq, and then Iraq suffers as well. And then they'll get a wet year when things are better. So it's become quite problematic. And they build these dams, not because it's a great part of the energy system necessarily, but partly for water control, and partly because big contractors make a lot of money out of building these dams, and politically connected contractors. It's simple as that. And local MPs want dams because it brings employment and investment, and even when it doesn't make too much sense. But I think there is now a realization in Iran that a lot of these dams are in the wrong place, not very well planned, and they're causing a lot of problems for water shortages, which is a really growing problem in Iran and in Iraq. And Iraq, of course, suffers from being downstream, both of Iran and Turkey. Turkey's more the problem for Iraq, but the dams in Iran don't help. And, the water flows into Iraq have got less and less. Iraq's own dams are not really maintained very well. And but anyway, they don't have a lot of water either. So their generation has really dropped off compared to where it was 20 years ago. And then, of course, agriculture and drinking water and so on suffer as well. And Iran is not above using these dams as a source of leverage over the Iraqi government. Turkey too, it's a common feature of discussion between Turkey and Baghdad, how much water you're going to release to the Tigris and Euphrates, as opposed to keeping it in Turkey for agriculture. So yeah, this water politics is very important, and it has an impact on the energy system as well. But that's what, when we talk about conventional hydro, it's, if we talk about the Middle East, it's really those 3 countries, and to some extent Egypt. Obviously the GCC doesn't have that option. But what the GCC does have, as Joumana says, is these kind of engineered hydro systems where you have a dam and you're pumping water up and down using it as a storage system, and you're not reliant on rainfall or any kind of natural water sources. There's the one in Dubai which will be completed soon. Saudi Arabia has a couple under construction. So absolutely, that's another help towards balancing the grid on over longer periods.
Oh, I've learned something new today. We've been talking about water, and there is obviously a water scarcity issue in the region, and one of the biggest, there's going to be more demand for desalination plants at the moment, mostly running on gas, right? Gas power. And air conditioning, as we get hotter. I'm sitting in Washington at the moment, and it was pretty hot. The last few days we've had heat waves in the United States. I mean, dangerous heat waves. And of course, that not only does it have an impact on demand for air conditioning, but it also has an impact on the on solar panels. They're not as efficient when you get dust storms, which you've seen, particularly in places like Iraq, which doesn't really have solar yet, but they're sort of hopefully building it up. So how do we manage this demand growth for desalination, for cooling, which is going to be even more acute as temperatures rise? Anybody want to take that one? Jamie, you haven't said anything.
Yeah, no,
for a while.
I was about to put my hand up for this one. Yeah, I mean, technological advances is the key answer to that one. Just like with solar power, so let's take solar power. In Dubai, they just inaugurated the 5th phase of the MBR solar plant. It occupies, I believe, around 10 kilometers. It's the same size as the 3rd phase, which was awarded 4 years earlier, and it's about half the size of that. So they're managing to pack in a lot more solar power capacity into a smaller space because of technological advances. The next phase will be equally, we can expect more advances in that level. So you're managing to make everything much more compact and efficient. Pivoting over to water desalination, we're now seeing countries in the region effectively, I'd say all of the plants coming online now are reverse osmosis plants, which are a lot more efficient than the older generation of facilities. So these require less energy, less space to pump out either the same or increased volumes of desalinated water. So these technological advances are a big boon for the massive groundswell in demand for water as temperatures rise and populations grow across the region. So I'd say that's the key issue there when it comes to desalination is, we've got to hang your hat on technological advances to bring more water to the masses.
Thanks. We have another question. Sorry, yes.
If you allow me to add on, James, we will need even more desalination plant as the hydrogen increases in the area, because hydrogen needs pure water. So this is demand for clean water, desalinized water will come huge to accompany the hydrogen. So this again is going to be a big demand soon. And there is another idea for ACs. There is a heat pump. So we're moving away from the traditional AC that it on equipment, that I follow the supply side. So this is the next big thing. We will use a more efficient heat pump instead of using ACs as we understand them now. So.
But heat pumps are still quite expensive, aren't they? I mean, don't we need subsidies in order to,
Still is, but this is how technology starts, and then it democratizes. So I think it's very complicated for retrofit at the moment, very expensive for retrofit, but maybe in new buildings, new cities, they will consider that as.
Somebody asked why we didn't discuss carbon trade yesterday. I think we sort of touched on it yesterday because I mentioned the carbon tax, and one of the speakers said, don't call it a carbon tax, but a sort of putting a price on carbon. I think we've discussed that already. So that question's been answered. I think Abu Dhabi may be preparing to launch a sort of carbon trading platform, but it hasn't happened yet. But of course, it would help if it were a regional trading market. The other question is, does Qatar or other large LNG exporters use their large LNG facilities for capturing the cold and using it domestically as air conditioning rather than burning more fossil fuels? I don't really quite understand, but Tofol, maybe that one's for you.
I'm not sure I understand either, because coldness doesn't, it means an absence of energy. So energy, it's like heat. That's so, no, capturing cold is the same as the idea that my 4-year-old daughter asked about the moon, because, you know, we're in Spain right now, and the moon reflects so brightly at night. She said, Mom, there's lots of solar panels here. Why aren't there lunar panels? Maybe one day she can invent that, hopefully. But in Qatar, no, we can't capture the cold. I wish we had cold to capture, but no, but we do have you know, a lot of advances in our facilities in the LNG production facilities to capture the methane. So it's gas, marketable gas, very valuable commodity that could be sold as energy, as LNG, could be liquefied, but it's being flared due to inefficiencies. And so Qatar and other countries, but Qatar has been taking the lead on this, pledge to achieve zero methane emissions by 2030. Saudi Aramco also joined that initiative. And Qatar has actually been leading up to that, working towards that goal from a long time ago. I think since 2012, there were already some measures being taken for economic incentives, because they, you know, they exist for sure, as well as climate benefits. And so Qatar aims by 2032 to have zero emissions from gas flaring, and by 2025 to reduce methane intensity to a level of 0.2%, rather low. And Qatar has made significant investments in that area, around $1 billion were invested in a project called the Jetty boil-off gas facility, and it removes around 90% of flared boil-off gas from that facility. And it's the same effect as removing 175,000 cars off the roads every year. So there are a lot of advances being made, and the beauty of it is that it goes hand in hand. When you help the environment, you can also help your pocketbook. So it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be at odds.
Yeah, no, you're right. I was actually recently in Doha, and it was quite interesting. They were talking about buses that were actually Chinese manufactured buses that are made to withstand extreme heat. And they even had, European countries coming to see what it was all about. As we said, the technology is evolving, and I think Irina put out a report yesterday, tracking the renewable energy deployment, and basically saying, we're still relying on too few technologies. So as they develop, and of course, all the scenarios at the moment are based on technologies that are in existence today, that are, that are commercial. But one of the things I think Qatar has done, they've already exported some so-called carbon neutral LNG cargoes to Japan. I think that it's sort of coming from demand for less carbon intensive products, and they are investing a lot in carbon capture and storage with their expansion. But one of what came out yesterday was that there is a lot being done in the GCC to decarbonize the energy sector, and it is scope 1 and scope 2. So you have to have demand side management. You've got to have energy efficiency, and I think that's also starting to come in the region. So can anybody give me an idea of what is going on, Jamie or Robin? What measures are being taken, new building standards, energy efficiency, and in transport, electric vehicles? I see a lot of them now on the streets of Dubai, which is a new development. What more needs to be done in order to achieve these net zero targets? Because, according to all these reports, we are off track on various sectors.
Yeah, I think we've covered quite a few of the measures. If you look at the UAE's nationally determined contribution, under the Paris Agreement, and there's a new one due shortly, I believe. But if you look at the latest one, so that sees that emissions by 2030 would be about 300 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and the NDC is to reduce that to 200, which is about the current level. So we kind of keep it flat on current levels, and despite a lot of economic growth and so on. And it kind of breaks that down into how much is power sector, which is most of it, and then industry and transport and so on. So I think we've seen, we've discussed the power sector pretty extensively, solar, nuclear, and so on. We've talked a bit about industry and hydrogen. We've not talked very much about transport, and that is a key one. That's probably the third big emitting sector. And exactly as you say, Kate, a year ago, even 6 months ago, you would very rarely see a Tesla in Dubai. It'd be so, oh wow, Tesla, that's interesting. It'd be quite a notable thing. Now you see them all the time, and that's in the space of 6 months, which I kind of find quite remarkable. Is it people like to show up a fancy car? It's probably a lot of it. Is it people like to show they're environmentally conscious? They get some savings on fuel, but fuel is not very expensive here. But whatever the drivers are, you do see a lot of Teslas there. And that's not driven by subsidies. There's no incentives. There's no particular policy other than providing chargers. But yet people are driving them. So we're seeing some action there on the transport side. And I think if you think about the GCC countries, other than Saudi Arabia, they're relatively small in area, and the range of an electric car, 300 miles, 500 miles, let's say, it's more than enough to go from one end of the country to the other and back again in most of the GCC. And so what more would you need? So I think there's a lot of potential for electric vehicles to be used here. And then you've got the aviation sector, which I think is a really interesting and challenging one, because Emirates and Etihad and Qatar Airways and so on, and Saudi Arabia wants to beef up its airline offerings. Huge part of the economy, and very big emitters, and they're reliant on very long distance flights, which are very high emitting. So there is thought about sustainable aviation fuels. We saw Qatar Airways chief a few days ago saying, sustainable aviation fuels, they're very expensive, unfortunately, and they are. But there are solutions, again, trying to make sustainable aviation fuels from hydrogen, making synthetic fuels that way. There's interest in the region. They'll be expensive to start with, but that's a route that the region has to go down as well.
But that means you have to adapt your aircraft have to be adapted. You've got to have the infrastructure at airports to store these new fuels. I mean, there's a lot that needs to be done to decarbonize the aviation industry, isn't there?
But it is possible to make drop-in fuels. There are routes to get from hydrogen to synthetic kerosene, which is essentially a perfect replacement for conventional kerosene. So, at some cost, you can get there, as you say, but with something that's compatible with the existing system. That's probably going to be a more realistic route than having actually directly hydrogen-powered airliners. Airbus is working on one, but then, as you say, you'll have all the problems with having to replace the entire air fleet and all the fueling systems and everything.
It's going to take a lot of time because your sustainable aviation fuel is such a small percentage at the moment. I was saying yesterday, I got an email from Air France where I have a loyalty program saying that they're committed to using 1% sustainable aviation fuel on their on their flights, which isn't really that much. Somebody asked the question: is the EV mass transit and school buses made in China and the US, are they also used as floating battery storage for peak demand periods? I don't know how that would work, but I think digitalization might help. Well, it is helping already, where you can actually swap.
You can for EV buses, EV trucks, if the distance is small, there is no issue whatsoever. So the battery built in the bus can absolutely do the route of the morning and the afternoon, because these are school buses. That was the question. There is no issue whatsoever. There is not even need for a battery swap. Battery swap is being used for heavy trucks to bridge between the EV to hydrogen transition, because lorries that move goods across GCC, let's say across countries, these cannot stop hours to charge. So you use battery swapping as a maybe an alternative, faster alternative until you reach the hydrogen. But for intercity buses, for school buses, EV is very basic. You have enough time to charge the buses. That's no issue.
Yeah, I wasn't really sure about what there is of floating battery storage for peak demand periods, but anyway, I mean, I think that there are plans, obviously, community.
The question is maybe to use the bus, or the fleet to charge the house, to put it in the grid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So yes, this is absolutely a good solution, a good storage solution, because when you don't need the battery of the car, you can use it to. And these are cases where there is shortage. I mean, UAE is definitely not a place that is interested in this, but let's say Iraq, let's say Lebanon, places where you have electricity shortage could absolutely use. Not even buses, passenger cars are enough to create this. Yes.
Kate, can I just make a couple of comments on the EV front as well? Yeah, as Robin was saying, there's obviously a big rollout of EVs in Dubai at the moment, and taking a look at Saudi Arabia in particular, and kind of linking that back to some of the earlier comments on local content. In Saudi Arabia, the PIF investment fund has made a massive investment in one of the EV manufacturers, Lucid, emerging not a massive market footprint globally, but there's quite a bit of optimism within some circles that they've got some decent models that are ready to come into production relatively soon. And Saudi Arabia says that Lucid is going to open up a manufacturing plant within the kingdom. So I suspect that what we will see once that starts operating is there will be a massive push within kingdom for kind of national pride, etc. You should be driving a Lucid, this type of thing. So that will help with the rollout of EVs within Saudi Arabia. And also as part, again, with the kind of local content issues, Saudi Arabia is trying to kickstart kind of a bit of a battery manufacturing supply chain. So recently announced with the Petro Rabi refinery that it's going to supply a planned plant to make graphite, which can then go into components for batteries, which can be again used in the planned EV plants there. So they're looking to get the supply chain there, and I think that's one of the things that within Saudi Arabia in particular can help give a real boost to EV rollout. Just the fact that this will be an in-kingdom product that that can use.
And of course that creates jobs because we've got a very young population. I think China is building a battery manufacturing plant in Saudi Arabia as well, which again goes back to having local content components to sort of drive the renewables. So we've got about 7 minutes left. If there's anything that anybody would like to add that we haven't really covered, I think we've covered quite a wide range, but we've kept out we've omitted a few areas like East Med and how they are, how the geopolitics of the region's changing the whole East Mediterranean sort of gas hub. I don't know if Robin, Jamie, we've written about it at MEES. Robin, you've written about it as well, and also Qatar being involved now in some of these gas projects in the East Mediterranean. Maybe a final word on that, because I think there's a gap in our conversation on that particular one, particularly with gas demand expected to remain fairly robust.
Yeah, I think a comment on that, Kate, in the context of our discussion earlier. Obviously, we've seen a great boost of gas reserves and gas production in the East Med in Egypt and Israel, and a lot of discoveries in Cyprus, which have not been developed yet, but maybe. And a lot of debate. Okay, how do you get this gas out of the region? You can use a lot domestically, but how do you export? Is it a pipeline to Europe, which is kind of politically challenging? Is it through LNG? Is it Egyptian LNG or new plants or whatever? We seem to be moving towards a solution with new plants either floating in Israel or in Cyprus. So we'll see where that goes. But in the context of the energy transition, this is kind of both a kind of a warning and an encouragement. I'll say a warning because there's a lot of gas here. It's on the doorstep of Europe. Europe is short of gas, wants to go off Russian gas. and yet it has proved very difficult to get this Znshine gas into Europe. And part of the reason is that Europe can't make long-term commitments on fossil fuels, even when it desperately needs it, and even when you could come up with creative ways to make sure that still fits within the EU's carbon budget. But on the more encouraging side, I think we're also seeing, we talked a bit earlier about long-distance cables, where there is under development electricity cable which will link Egypt, Cyprus, Israel, and then go on to Greece, that will take electricity, which could of course be renewable electricity, into southeastern Europe. And there's been some feasibility work on a hydrogen pipeline. So that's part of the concept when you could build a gas pipeline that's hydrogen ready, and when the hydrogen production ramps up from Egypt, which has a lot of plans, then you can convert that pipeline to hydrogen, and you've got a route into Europe. You get to Greece, get to Italy, that way, and bring hydrogen at a much more competitive transport cost. And there's been work done on this. Yeah, it looks technically feasible, looks economically competitive. So there are other potentials, I think, to kind of build on the gas that's been discovered here, but think long term, think how does that fit in a decarbonizing Europe?
Okay, I think this brings us to the end because Bill's going to have the sort of the final word. Thank you all so very much for your contributions. I think we've covered a whole range of issues, and we can still go for another hour, I think. But thank you again, Bill. Over to you for your final word. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for all of our distinguished guests today. Really, really interesting discussion. I think in many ways, in all of the different aspects that you spoke about, you're really looking to the future, and you've teed us up very well to look forward to COP28 in the fall. Kate, many thanks to you also for all the work you've done pulling together Petro Diplomacy, helping us with that this year. And a shout out to our program team also, Raymond Karam and Busha Lawrence, for all their efforts in pulling together Petro Diplomacy. I want to thank all of our guests for the panels today, both today and yesterday, for the entire 2-day set of programs, for this great Petro Diplomacy set of programs that we've had. We look forward to seeing all of you at our future programs, and we'll see you later. Thank you.